possibility of bringing French forces back into the war against Germany, and thought of the North African operation as a relatively cheap means of seizing the initiative from Hitler. At the same time, the United States was busily engaged in the Pacific, particularly with the Guadalcanal operation, which began on 7 August 1942. In late August 1942, the Soviet Union was to see the beginning of the Stalingrad attack by the Germans. Churchill journeyed to Moscow to take news to Joseph Stalin, premier of the Soviet Union. The Western Allies were not going to invade the continent in 1942, but instead were to attack Northwest Africa before the end of October. Churchill explained Operation Torch and what was hoped it would do. He was greatly surprised when Stalin agreed with its concept. After Churchill's visit to Moscow, and with Roosevelt's complete approval, plans went ahead swiftly for the Allied invasion of North Africa. On 14 August, the combined chiefs of staff appointed General Dwight D. Eisenhower, then in command of the American forces in England, to be commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, and directed him to prepare plans for the landing. 3 task forces were developed for the operation. The Western Task Force was to capture Casablanca, the Center Task Force the city of Oran, and the Eastern Task Force the seaport of Algiers. In each case, these amphibious landings were to be made in the classical historic mode of pinching off a seaport by attacking from the flanks rather than head-on. The Western Task Force, under the command of Major General George S. Patton, included infantry troops and Major General Ernest Harmon's forces. Harmon had elements of the 2nd Armored Division, while the infantry was part of the 9th Infantry Division. The Central Task Force at Oran was commanded by Major General Lloyd Fredendall and included the 1st Infantry Division and Major William Darby's Ranger Battalion. At Algiers, the landing force consisted of a British division, a regimental combat team from the American forces, and 3 British commando units. It was just 3 hours before the start of the greatest amphibious operation in history. With the hands of the ship's clock into 8 November 1942, I was standing on the bridge of HMS Ulster Monarch, with the master of the ship trying to pierce the fog. Pricks of doubt ran through both our minds as we considered the assault landing to be made at Arzew, east of Oran, by my command, the 1st Ranger Battalion. Arzew was now some 30 miles off our starboard bow. Strange lights flickered in the distance along the shore, raising questions as to whether the landing force had been discovered. What would the French do? Would they fight bitterly, or would they give up after their honor had been satisfied by strong resistance against an aggressive assault? A beacon, flashing its signal in a circle, spoke reassuringly. Perhaps the Rangers were going to make a landing in the dark, without blue jets of flame crossing their path, or large shells sending up waterspouts close by the landing boats. The fog was growing thicker. I drifted over to the port side of the bridge and stared into the water. But close astern, I could barely make out the misty outlines of HMS Royal Scotsman and HMS Royal Ulsterman, bearing the remainder of the 1st Ranger Battalion. Suddenly, I stiffened with fright. 2 silver objects, racing with terrific speed, were heading for the ships. My God, torpedoes. We've been discovered. Clutching the master of the ship by the arm, I pointed shakily toward those streaks of foam in the sea. For a few seconds, we stared at them in numbed silence. The streaks were within 25 yards of the ship and closing fast. As they approached nearer and nearer, I instinctively threw my hands to my head as if to protect myself from the expected explosion. Then, as the objects were within a few yards of the ship, they leaped out of the water, throwing a fountain of spray. Diving gracefully, the 2 porpoises, for that was what they were, changed course to follow the ship. We mopped the perspiration from our foreheads and laughed weakly. The North African invasion by United Nations forces was an awesome venture. For months, the public of the various countries of the United Nations had called for a second front, and when American troops first went to Northern Ireland and England, there was some feeling that the invasion of the continent was imminent. The soldiers on this expedition knew only that they were going to the north coast of Africa.